The story of women gaining the right to vote in America is one that spans decades of legislation, protests, imprisonment, and drama on both the state and national level, with women finally gaining the right to vote in all elections in every state just in time for the 1920 presidential election. Whilst the full story of women gaining the right to vote is too long to recount in one video, this is the story of the legislative battle that finally brought the years-long fight to an end. The story of Tennessee's 1920 War of the Roses. Whilst women could vote in presidential elections in some states before 1920, with Wyoming being the first to give women the vote in 1869 while it was still a territory, there was no federal law that gave women the right to vote on a national level. To cut a long story short, by 1918, women could vote in many states, mostly in the west and midwestern parts of the country. These states totaled a combined electoral vote of 326 out of 531, a clear majority, and with women's service in factories during World War I, it was clear to many at this point that women's suffrage was inevitable. But in order to allow all women across the country to vote, and make sure that women's suffrage could not be taken away at a later date, it was necessary to pass an amendment to the US Constitution. An amendment to the US Constitution must be passed by 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate. After trying and failing 5 times, and some attempts to block and filibuster the bill, it eventually passed, with 304 to 89 votes in the House and 56 to 25 votes in the Senate, with 14 abstaining, giving the required 2-to-1 ratio in both houses. But an amendment also requires that 3/4 of the states must ratify the amendment by approving it in their state legislatures. And in 1920, with 48 states, that meant that 36 states needed to approve the amendment before it could take effect, more than had previously allowed women's suffrage, meaning passage of the amendment was not yet a done deal. By February 1920, 32 of the required 36 states had ratified the amendment, with the National Women's Party, under the leadership of Alice Paul, sewing a star on a flag for each state that had ratified the amendment, until they hit the magic number of 36. But from then on, the trickle of states ratifying the amendment became slower. 33, Oklahoma; 34, West Virginia; 35, Washington State; and then, for 5 months, nothing. In fact, instead of ratifying, 8 states had voted against the amendment, leaving only 5 states up for grabs to provide that last needed vote. And with the 1920 presidential election only 4 months away, the race was on to quickly pass the amendment, because if they didn't, women would have to wait another 4 years to vote in a presidential election. And to make matters worse, the state legislatures that could vote on the matter were not in session at the time. Most people thought the final state to ratify would be a northern Republican state, such as Vermont or Connecticut, as women's suffrage was unpopular in the largely Democratic South. But surprisingly, the Democratic governor of Tennessee called a special session of the state legislature to vote on the amendment. Now, all eyes were on Tennessee, since it was potentially the last state needed to pass the amendment. Therefore, the debate in Tennessee received national attention, with women both for and against suffrage traveling to the state. Yellow was the colour of the suffragette movement, and so many advocating for women's voting rights wore yellow roses, whereas anti-suffragettes of both sexes wore red roses to show their allegiance. Tennessee's War of the Roses had begun. The state was deeply divided on the issue of women's suffrage. Nationally, Democrats were more likely to oppose the amendment. Of the 35 states that had ratified so far, most were Republican. Yet there was speculation that Republicans in Tennessee would vote against ratification, as they didn't want a Democrat-controlled state to be the last to ratify, in case Democrats got the credit for the amendment as a whole. Also, those representing the alcohol industry didn't want women to get the vote, as prohibition and the women's voting rights movement were seen as being interlinked. More sinisterly, Josephine A. Pearson, an anti-suffragist woman from Tennessee wearing a red rose, also opposed it, as it would give black women the right to vote as well. But surprisingly, when the vote for the amendment went to the Tennessee State Senate, the amendment passed by a substantial margin, 25-4. It was now up to the Tennessee Lower Assembly to decide the amendment's fate. More red rose sporting anti-suffragists traveled to the state from all over, even outside Tennessee itself, hoping to sway the vote and block passage of the amendment. When the vote was finally taken, incredibly, it was a tie, 48-48. A vote to delay the bill and vote on it on a different day also deadlocked at 48-48. This meant that another vote had to be taken immediately, but if that also failed to pass, the amendment would die in Tennessee. For a third time, the vote was taken, with each state assemblyman giving their vote, yet seemingly no one changing their mind. That is until the Speaker of the House came to State Assemblyman Harry T. Byrne, the youngest member of the state Congress at only 24, elected 2 years previously. Byrne had voted against the amendment the first 2 times and even wore a red anti-suffragette rose in his lapel. But when the Speaker called on him to vote, he hesitated, then quietly answered aye. This stunned the crowd, as they knew that this one change would mean the amendment would pass, and women would finally get the vote. Byrne explained the reason for his change of heart like this. His mother, Mrs. Febb Byrne, had sent him the following letter. Dear son, hurrah, and vote for suffrage. I noticed some of the speeches against, and have been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything. Don't forget to be a good boy, and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification. Mrs. Cat, or Carrie Chapman Cat, was the head of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and her rats were her followers who supported ratification. Harry Byrne explained that with the vote tied and only one vote needed to change the outcome, he couldn't in good conscience stand in the way of ratification and disappoint his mother, and so changed his vote to be in favour. Some sources say that after the vote, Byrne was chased out of the chamber by enraged red rose-wearing anti-suffragists, but this is disputed. Regardless, despite some last-minute legal wranglings, the vote was confirmed, and the amendment passed. The suffragettes could sew on the 36 star on their flag, and in the 1920 presidential election, women could now vote. The actual signing of the amendment into law by Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby was done with no fanfare, and no members of the various women's suffrage movements present. But with that, women's suffrage was now law, and Tennessee's short but dramatic War of the Roses was over. And with one letter from a mother to her son, and one changed vote in one last state finally tipping the decades-long fight for the vote over the finish line. And with that, America was changed, and history was made.